Yeah, this is kind of an ad hoc thing. I named the presentation Anecdotes about Variants because this is mostly just me pondering out loud about things I've noticed about this kind of design pattern that has happened a couple of times and keeps happening when I'm making games, and kind of pondering about the pros and cons of that. So unfortunately, don't expect anything very like academically interesting out of this. This is mostly just, yeah, anecdotal, maybe interesting observations. Just in case there is someone here who doesn't know who I am, I'm a Finnish game developer from Helsinki. I've been making games since 2002 is the usual answer. The actual answer is a little bit more complicated, but 2002 is a okay approximation. I'm not a quote unquote real programmer. I've been using game creation tools since the beginning. For the past 10 years, I've been also using the Lua scripting language, but I still haven't graduated to like a real programming languages, and I'm okay with that. But yeah, I do usually when I give presentations, especially if I be giving it to students, I want to underline the kind of I'm not a quote unquote real game developer because I don't use actual programming languages, so that because I know that in some circles it can be there can be like a kind of a gatekeepy approach to feeling inadequate if you are not like using C++ or if you're only using Game Maker Studio or something. And I do want to avoid that kind of a mindset. Obviously, probably not as big of a problem for here, but still wanted to mention it. So I'm going to present kind of 3 different examples of this phenomenon of like a multitude of variants appearing in my own work. And after these 3 examples, I'm going to ponder a little bit on like, what does it mean? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What am I actually even talking about here? And then that'll basically be the conclusion of the presentation. So the first example I'm going to give is this thing called Covemountlikes. So in 2024, there was a discussion on a Discord server, on the Thinky Puzzles Discord server, about movement counters in puzzle games, which is kind of a controversial topic a little bit in like grid-based, turn-based puzzle games, because they can be something that some people really enjoy, the kind of optimization gameplay they bring, while for some people, including me, they are kind of poison. And I'm not sure if I made like a joke suggestion at the time or if I saw someone else make a joke suggestion of like a puzzle game about move counters, but I got this mental image of like, what if there was a puzzle game where the movement counter itself is kind of part of the puzzle, like it's a puzzle mechanic. And I specifically got the mental image of like a Sokoban block pushing puzzle game where the movement counter is something you push around. And after pondering about this joke a little bit, it seemed like, hey, that could be like that has some vaguely interesting implications when it comes to block pushing puzzles. So maybe I'll spend a couple of days making a small engine. Making a small engine and make a little browser-based puzzle game exploring this idea of Sokoban, but you have a movement counter, but the movement counter, instead of kind of being a limiter on how optimal your solution is, it's actually like an active element in the puzzle solving. And so I spent a couple of days, maybe like 1 day, 2 days, making a simple engine. And while I was working on that engine, I got some other ideas of, oh, hey, I also have these simple concepts that could be turned into simple explorations of funky ideas. I think the first 2 that I came up with were this idea that I had previously of a game where each wall is a warp portal. So if you walk against the wall, you will immediately wrap around to the closest wall on the opposite side of the screen. And so pushable blocks can be used to make kind of to alter the wraparound points of the level. And when working on this move counter joke game, I started thinking, hey, I could actually explore that idea that I had thought of previously that I had never implemented using this same simple browser-based engine. It's going to be a bunch of extra work, but it shouldn't be too much work. Then I also got the idea of, hey, I had this idea of what if there was a block pushing puzzle game where you can use the mouse to draw additional blocks for yourself. And then I realized that, okay, if I want to explore that, I can still use the same basic engine, but now I will need to add support for multiple, like blocks that span multiple spaces. And that seemed like a kind of a bigger thing to tackle, but still fairly manageable. And so as I was working on these ideas, I got more ideas. I started thinking of other little puzzle game ideas I've pondered of in the past that I had kind of filed in an archive of, this is an interesting idea, but it might not work as a full-scale game, or this is an interesting idea, but making a larger game out of it might be annoying in whatever way. And I realized over time that I had more and more of these concepts that fulfilled a couple of different pointers or category, like a criteria, some of which were, for example, that, okay, this idea is too janky, too kind of quote unquote bad to work as a full-scale game. Like I wouldn't be able to make 30 levels for this idea, but I might be able to make 10 levels for it. Or there would be ideas that I had previously considered that I had filed away as kind of like, okay, I will return to this later because I'm not excited about this idea enough to make a full-scale game out of it right now, but I might want to make one later. And I thought that, okay, well, maybe I could actually repurpose those ideas and never actually make the kind of full-scale game out of them, but instead use this browser engine and create like a small 15-level idea prototype of that concept, and be able to internally call that idea done to kind of move on from the idea if it turned out that I was never quite certain if I was really interested in making like a full scale thing out of them. So there were a couple of these categories of concepts that I either had previously thought of, or that came to me while working on these other ideas. And over the course of 2024, I made, I think, 31 games in total. All of them were, I think the largest of them had like 22 levels. Most of them had usually 14 levels and then one like a victory screen level. I kept polishing the browser, the engine a little bit, adding undo, adding the support for those multi-tile blocks and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately I kept things fairly simple. And I still have more ideas based on this. I have in my game ideas notebook, I have now implemented like a category of entry that I call just ban from Sokoban. That is like, if I get an idea that seems like, okay, this is maybe not interesting enough to be a larger scale game, I might write it down as one of these ban ideas, and then I might revisit it and make these kind of Covemount-like games out of them. A nice thing about this approach in general was that because I was mentally in the headspace of making these tiny browser games that always used the same graphics, were visually very simplistic, didn't have any audio, were hacked together in just a couple of days. Some of them took a little bit longer if the engine required it, but mostly I was able to get them together in just a couple of days. This kind of gave me this mental freedom of exploring these quote-unquote bad ideas, these ideas that maybe wouldn't really work on any larger scale, while still presenting them to an audience. Some of the ideas were specifically kind of very unusual or like trolley ideas that were never meant to be really like easily approachable. There's one particular one, Mountainoom, where that draws inspiration from I think Moxmo's game Ponkyban, where the idea is that it's a Sokoban game, but you can move in increments smaller than the full tile. So you start having issues with this kind of like parity with the grid. And that idea is something that is very frustrating to play. It's kind of annoying to work with, but it's also very funny at its base concept. So it was like a perfect choice for this Covemountlikes because it was kind of a, again, quote unquote, bad idea that I could still explore and like experiment with and present to players because I didn't feel kind of beholden to this internal idea of playability or something. I've been thinking about making a collection of these. This idea of this Covemount collection is in my head and has been for a couple of years. I'll see if that happens. The second example is a solitaire mystery, a game I released originally in 2024, and then I've made a Steam release last year, which is a collection of little solitaire card games with usually the emphasis being that they are bizarre or odd in some way. Like they take the like solitaire card game gameplay system and explore some kind of a wacky element of it. Knexator, who is in this voice chat, also made one guest contribution to it, the time travel solitaire. And then Hazelstorm, who is not here, also there have been a couple of guest solitaires in the collection. I think the game currently has like 30, exactly 30 or maybe 32 or something solitaires, and I still have ideas for more. I would like to add a couple more in an update. The beginning of this thing was that in, I think, 2023, the Zachtronic Solitaire Collection was released, or maybe it happened even earlier, maybe it was 2022. I've been mildly interested in solitaires before, but playing Zachtronic Solitaire Collection kind of made me more seriously interested in the concept of these single-player traditional card deck of cards card games. And I noticed kind of a similar effect as with those Covemountlikes. To be honest, chronologically, this happened before the Covemountlikes, so I'm actually explaining this out of order. But there was a very similar effect of me getting like an initial idea of like, if I would make a solitaire game, what kind of a thing could I make? Here's a funny idea that I would like to try. And then as I worked on that idea, as I developed that idea further in 2022, yeah, it must have been autumn 2022 when the Solitaire Collection released, because in the end of 2022, I made a couple individual browser-based tests of these solitaire ideas I could think of. And I started noticing this kind of ideas giving me more ideas for further solitaires. And I started writing those ideas down, and eventually I collected together into this solitaire collection. And as mentioned, I still have more ideas. So it's similarly to the Covemountlikes, these ideas keep kind of building up. Working on one idea gives inspiration for further ideas, and it just kind of keeps on happening over time. Obviously, initially, there's more to work with, more kind of ground to explore, so the pace slows down as I get through these concepts, but there's still a very noticeable kind of inspiration begets inspiration kind of element at work there. Something that was potentially useful for a solitaire mystery specifically is that because I wasn't originally super interested in these kinds of card games, I didn't have pre-existing knowledge, pre-existing notions to the same extent as with like Sokoban games for what these kinds of card games were about. Someone pointed out on itch.io that, for example, my game calls certain elements the wrong names. Like there are kind of conventions within solitaire games to what you call the like stacks where you build up cards and what you call the stacks on which you play with the cards. And I was using the wrong terms because I wasn't familiar with the genre. If we want to see something positive with this lack of knowledge, is that it maybe might have given me some ideas that I otherwise wouldn't have had because I didn't know, my mind wasn't as set on the conventions of the genre, but who knows, impossible to say. Something that when pondering about this presentation, I wanted to kind of tie together the presentation a little bit by observing this kind of like this concept of having a simple basic idea and building variations out of it. And with the Covemountlikes, it was very easy to see that the basic idea was the Sokoban block pushing games. And then I started making variations out of that by considering like what is a wacky context in which I could put these solitaire games, not solitaire, the Sokoban games. With a solitaire mystery, technically there's a similar thing where the base concept is a solitaire card game, a traditional card game that you play on your own. But as I was pondering about this presentation, I kind of realized that the concept of a solitaire is maybe less one and done. Like I feel like with Sokoban, it's much easier to kind of pare down the crucial base elements that you're working with. With a solitaire, I'm much less certain. It's single player. It uses a deck of cards. But then there are a bunch of elements, this kind of like building stacks out of cards, moving the stacks around, and ultimately gathering the cards, usually in numeric order, usually in order by suit at the end. And those seem to be conventions that usually appear in a solitaire game, but I've definitely seen solitaire games that are not about that. So it felt, I started noticing that the kind of base concept that I was varying was maybe less intuitive and less compact in its definition. So I started pondering that maybe I'll need some other definition of what is the kind of base component at work here, but we will get to that a little bit later. The third example, which is maybe the shakiest out of these, is I've been making a bunch of two-player abstract board games over the past 5 years. It started in 2021, starting with me reading a book by Terry Pratchett, which included an imaginary board game inspired by the real-world game Hnetatafel. And I started thinking of like, what if I made a board game based on the description in Terry Pratchett's book Thud, basically the game Thud that is mentioned in the book's name. And I made up a rule set based on that and playtested it with a bunch of people, eventually meeting up with some people really enthusiastic about developing board games. And that kind of led me down this rabbit hole of making these two-player abstract board games, or abstract to some degree of abstractness, basically chess-esque board games. And here, I feel like the base concept of what is the minimum component of this that I'm varying is even less well defined. But there are definitely certain things that are kind of the base building blocks. The kind of you have some kind of a grid where you have some kind of pawns or pieces that are placed or move around. They have some kinds of movement patterns, and there's some kind of a win condition, usually around capturing other units, but it might be also like preventing the opponent from moving. And again, this is something where working on ideas brought in more ideas, but more slowly than for the other two examples. One big limitation here is that because these are board games, the rules have to be simple enough that they can be taught easily. They cannot have the under the hood moving part that video games can have. The fact that they need to be two-player, and so also playtesting these was more difficult than the single-player video games that I made in the other two examples. And also because I wanted to keep things very simple, these were rules-wise more kind of bare bones, which introduced some other difficulties that I didn't have with the other two examples. But I do still feel like there are enough similarities with this these board games to the other two examples that I wanted to include it in this presentation. I've been thinking of making a digital collection of these, preferably with like a computer opponent using maybe like a simple Monte Carlo algorithm to play against you, partially because it would be a nice way to present these ideas to people who don't have people to play with, because with board games, a big limitation is that you need to have someone to play with unless they are solitaires. But also something that interests me is that when it comes to this, like making small variants of an existing base concept, it might be very fast to iterate on interesting seeming ideas if I have this simple computer opponent that I can easily teach a given set of rules to and see kind of like, okay, well, if we have 6 pieces on this kind of a board and they move like this and capture like this, how does it feel to play against the CPU opponent without having to wait for a friend of mine to have enough time to maybe play like a very half-baked idea? So I'm interested in that. We'll see if that happens. Anyway, those are the 3 examples. And here are some observations I've done about these 3 examples, although I feel like I could easily come up with some other similar examples of the same phenomenon happening on a more abstract or more, more abstract level in earlier parts of my game development career / hobby. But so the starting point is that there's some kind of a quote-unquote simple, potentially simple basic idea that gives you some kind of a inspiration of what if I combine this idea with something else? What if I inject this other thing into this simple concept, and then you explore what happens? And potentially what you might see is that something interesting but unplayable happens, which you can still present to other people. Or you might notice that, okay, actually something really interesting happens, and then you can make something out of it. And another observation, or like the big observation that I've done, the thing that kind of inspired me to suggest this presentation for this occasion in the first place, was that something that has been very exciting to me personally is that I tend to notice that when I get into this mindset of taking the same base concept and trying to inject different ideas to that base concept, I keep coming up with new concepts, and it becomes this kind of self-feeding process, obviously only to an extent, as I mentioned earlier, but still. And I guess this could be described also through the lens of exploring a concept in depth, where, for example, I'm taking the concept of the Sokoban game and I'm trying to combine it with different random stuff and seeing what sticks in order to explore the design space of a Sokoban game more fully. But I do feel that the like exploring concept in depth is maybe it's maybe a too refined term. I personally think of this much more from a very like a slapdash approach, where I'm just like, hey, this could be funny. It's gonna be cursed. It's gonna be unplayable. It's gonna be jank, but I think it's interesting and I want to showcase it to the world, instead of being kind of like, what are all the nuanced, interesting interactions that I can pull out of this concept that I can introduce to other people as the master puzzle game designer or something like that. I enjoy the idea of this being much more of a trashy process. And here comes the thing that I mentioned earlier, where instead of thinking about the base concept as simple as possible. So, for example, like instead of saying that, okay, the starting point is a Sokoban, is a solitaire card game, is a 2-player abstract board game, and trying to claim that all of those are similarly simplistic, it might be better to try to describe them through the lens of maybe familiarity or conveyability, where the kind of base concept that is easy to vary might be less something that is simple and more something that your audience, or some hypothetical audience, or you yourself is already familiar with, that is something that you can like wrap your head around very easily. So a solitaire game is, I feel like the definition of a solitaire game is kind of hazy. Maybe there's like an academic definition that I've never read, but at least for me, it feels like there's a lot of like little moving parts. The actual definition is kind of uncertain, but it's a very familiar concept. It's easy to convey in my mind to myself the like basic idea of what a solitaire game looks like. So it's easy for me to start from that and start implementing these variations. Similarly, for a two-player abstract board game, even if, as I mentioned, there are many little moving parts and it's kind of potentially difficult to say what would be the like absolute basic, absolute core of a two-player abstract board game. I have a friend who would even call the games that I make not abstract games because they are not truly abstract. According to this friend, for example, chess is not an abstract board game because it simulates war. So only games like Go are truly abstract because they don't simulate anything on any level. So even there, the like base concept of an abstract board game is not as simple as would initially seem. So in that way, it might be easier to think that I have a very clear mental presentation of what a two-player abstract board game is. I'm very familiar with this internal definition, and it's easy for me to wrap my head around this internal definition, and so it's easy to start from that and start making these variations. So I don't know. I don't know if that is useful to anyone else, but it seemed like an interesting thought to myself. And when thinking about this, I also started feeling like kind of a similar process of a concept, a base concept of some kind is being taken and then endless variations being pulled out of it as people explore the concept and try to apply different variations to it can be seen on a larger level in a lot of different places, not necessarily within a single developer like in these examples that I gave, but rather within a genre or within like a family of media products. So for example, the Sokoban games that have become so famous, so popular in the thinky puzzle games circles have a lot of examples of this, where it's like, what if Sokoban, but the puzzle was wrapped around on a toroidal space? Or what if Sokoban, but some things ignore undo? Or what if Sokoban, but you move multiple things, and so on. So, and it kind of on some level feels like multiple developers are doing the same process to the concept of Sokoban games. And I feel like this is something that people have already said a million times over the years, but it was a little bit interesting to me to consider that, oh yeah, I'm kind of doing within the context of my own game development, I'm doing kind of a thing that can be seen on a macro level within the entirety of Sokoban games. Similarly with roguelikes, especially with roguelites, for example, the like deck building roguelites, you can kind of see the thing where people are releasing increasing amounts of games that have this very similar basic concept of here's a deck building roguelite, and then okay, some of them don't do anything interesting. Some of them just do Slay the Spire or just do Balatro, or maybe they do Balatro but with microtransactions, which is maybe not the most interesting variation to do in my opinion. But some of them also do kind of like, what if Balatro, but instead you are playing on a roulette board, or taking this like, can we pare down this concept of roguelite to its very basics and then apply those basics into something else? So they take this concept of like, you pick from 3 perks and you do some kind of a run, but then exactly what the run is about changes. Or there's like a Die in the Dungeon where it's a deck building roguelite, but instead of having a deck of cards, you have a deck of dice. There's a lot of, I feel like, similar energy there. And then also in board games, I'm kind of noticing a similar thing where it feels like these quote unquote Eurogame board games. Eurogame is a specific kind of genre of board game where usually the games are about gathering victory points. Usually you don't directly interact with other players, but rather you block opportunities and you try to raise other players for some prizes. So they are like low interaction, low conflict, more moving parts, more like a mechanically complex board games usually. That is my very pared down definition. So, and in Eurogames, I've kind of started noticing a pattern where there are a lot of Eurogames that have a lot of similarities to existing Eurogames, where they take some similar parts like, oh, this game takes this concept from that other Euro game, and it has this action selection system from that other board game, but then it also adds this minor additional innovation, or maybe it combines these ideas in a new way, and so it creates this like slight variation on a familiar concept to hopefully make things interesting. And at the very least, from a designer viewpoint, it can be interesting to consider of like, oh yeah, they combined these things in a novel way. Like they added this, they injected this unusual thing to this kind of cliche, already seen basic concept, or this collection of concepts. And so it might give some food for thought, if nothing else. I'll get to, there are some maybe drawbacks to this that I'll get to on the last slide, which is the next slide. So let's return to this concept of the Euro games in a moment. But I do want to point out that this, trying to see this making variations out of base concept on this level, maybe generalizing things a little bit too much, because obviously any kind of design, any kind of like combining ideas can be seen from this lens. So maybe I'm getting kind of too excited about this concept by claiming that the process of people making roguelites or making Sokoban games on a larger scale, or making these board games on a larger scale, can be viewed from the same lens. But maybe it can be inspiring in some way. I don't know. It felt slightly inspiring to me, so I wanted to mention it, even if I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Finally, I wanted to explain some, from my perspective, pros and cons that I've noticed when doing this process multiple times, of kind of like taking a base concept of thinking of like, what kind of simple variations can I think of that might take this idea into in some way an interesting new direction, even if it doesn't lead to into a good game, but it leads to something interesting. First of all, it's very addictive. I think the kind of like ideas begetting more ideas, it's a very fun mind space to be in, because you can keep pondering about like, well, what if time travel, or what if I try to combine something completely different? Like, for example, currently one of the ideas that I haven't implemented for those Covemount-like Sokoban puzzles is that, could I somehow combine Sokoban with a detective novel? Like, what if you are presented with a solution of a puzzle, and then you do like a whodunit of like how did this block end up on this spot? Then you have to follow the like footsteps in the snow to figure out which one of these Sokoban puzzle solvers actually pushed that block in there. So it's like a murder mystery, but with Sokoban blocks, and that tickles my brain in a good way. It's fun to tinker with these concepts. This also leads to it being very inspiring to me to think about these things, because there's a very the kind of trashiness that I mentioned earlier gives this a very kind of throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks kind of vibe, where if I'm making these very tiny, very bite-sized things that I might later on collect into a collection, or I might just leave them as their own little things, it kind of gives me this mental freedom of just doing whatever feels interesting. And if they feel like they have potential for something larger, then maybe I can reconsider those ideas later, or use them in some way. But in the moment, I only have to care about the actual implementation, and then the question of like, is this interesting in my opinion? Sorry, I need to take a sip. The next point relates again to the same thing, where in this specific that I've done, the being able to reuse assets both in Covemountlikes and Solitaire Mystery, I was able to use the same base components for prototyping, and I could, well, a Solitaire Mystery became a full commercial game, so there I had to eventually give it a bunch of polish. But especially for the Covemountlikes, the games don't have any audio. They use mostly the same assets in every game. They're very bare bones, and that kind of both enhances this idea that I'm just throwing stuff at the wall, I'm just having fun making these things, but also just make it much faster to make things, which also feels like something that could have potential for a game jam entry. Like this approach of thinking of a base concept that is close to your heart, that you can wrap your head around, and trying to create some kind of a small iteration of it feels like something that I might want to try at the game jam. Then the cons are, the returning to the Eurogames, is that if what you do is that you take a basic concept where the basic concept might not be simple in itself, it might actually be a fairly large thing, and then you apply some small variation and you see what happens. If the base concept is too large, it might be that the little variation is so tiny compared to the rest that while it might bring forth some kind of an interesting change, some kind of an interesting implication, it might not be enough to make the whole process really worth it. This is maybe more of like a business consideration, especially with these Euro games. I feel like I've seen a lot of people, or a bunch of people, complain that there are currently a lot of Euro games that are that have very expensive components, that are very large, take a long time to play, where the gameplay experience is very similar to a lot of existing board games in the same genre, except for that one variation. And so the one variation might not be worth it for the price of entry and the time it takes to get acquainted with the game and actually play through it multiple times to like appreciate the little variation and what it adds to the mix. So maybe this is something that works best on smaller things. And then from a business consideration viewpoint, a lot of these ideas, like a lot of the Covemountlikes specifically, for example, are things that I wouldn't even want to make full-scale games out of, where they are too jank, too cursed, too messy, too annoying to deal with to really be worthwhile to turn into kind of full-scale anything. If we consider full-scale as like a paid game that you spend multiple hours playing, instead of being like a 15-level thing that you play through in a couple of hours or 1 hour or less, or like 15 minutes. I don't want to put too much emphasis on this point, because I feel like it's very much just about a question that only matters if you're trying to make money out of this, which is obviously an important consideration, because people unfortunately need to make money in this capitalistic hell world we live in. But ideally, obviously, this wouldn't be, you wouldn't need to care. The only thing you would need to care about is that, am I having fun making this? Is this something that I find interesting? But as a small side point to this, I did mention both for for all three of the examples I gave, that there was some element of either having already made a collection of them or wanted to make a collection. So for the Covemountlikes, the 2-player abstract board games, for both of those, I'm interested in making like a digital collection of them. And I feel like if we really want to care about the kind of like marketability of an idea like this, where you have multiple smaller ideas that you are varying in different ways and you want to see where it goes, and some of them are very messy and quote unquote bad, then one way to present them to a larger audience could be to make a collection of them, where if one of the entries in the collection is kind of messy and you present it as like, hey, this is going to be messy, so prepare yourself mentally, then you would be able to present them with something more refined and be kind of like, well, if you don't care about this messy part, if you don't find it fun, you can at least look at this more refined thing, so you don't feel like you missed out on anything, or you don't just get frustrated. You can actually get something out of this. And finally, a kind of a pro/con, like I don't know where I would put this on the scale of good and bad things, is that I've noticed that the addictiveness of this process is kind of dangerous, because the dopamine I get from making a small release that I can put easily up on itch.io and immediately get some feedback from people of like, oh yeah, that was interesting, or that was cursed, or Hempuli makes another crime of a video game. It's very fun to get that response. It's very fun to present these to players. And then when I have some long-term projects that I work on over multiple years, and I keep tinkering on them, and I might have something to show people and get some positive feedback or critical feedback, but I'm still not releasing them, it can be very tempting to spend less time on those long-term projects and instead spend more time on these bite-sized projects, because I can get so much more of that quick satisfaction of like, yeah, I released the thing. Like last year in 2025, I spent most of the year working on my large-scale projects. And by the end of the year, I was looking at my list of released games and I was feeling disappointed that I didn't have as many entries that year than I had in 2024, because in 2024 I released 32 or 31 of these tiny Covemountlikes, and I feel like that kind of a comparison, while understandable, is kind of dangerous, because yeah, it implies that I'm putting a little bit too much weight on this idea of releasing multiple titles, even if the titles are just 1 hour, 15 minutes long. In and I'm like and I might be like overlooking the benefit of working on a game for a longer period of time to release something more polished, something more long form, because obviously those long form games have their own strengths that only they can do, that these like tiny bite-sized things can't do. So it's there's definitely kind of a danger of getting lost in the sauce in there. But yeah, I hope these anecdotes were in some way useful to someone. This is very looking at my own brain and talking about things that I find interesting in my own things. So I'm sorry for this being so egocentric, but yeah, I hope someone found something interesting here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, lots of things to to think about. Like, I thought it was pretty funny that you took like that imaginary game from this world and start like toying with idea and some of the things you mentioned, like, hey, what if like Sokoban, but it's a murder mystery, and overall, I don't know, like, hey, how all these like affects, like you were saying at the end, like your workflow and your own motivation and the way you approach other things. So yeah, I thought that was all interesting. As usual, we're having some time for questions. For a reminder, like it's perfectly fine to type questions in the chat. It's also perfectly fine to use your microphone and just post your your questions literally. Um, and yeah, like again, like lots of things and seeing some comments about the talk on the chat. But yeah, I don't know if anybody has further questions about like I don't know specific experiments that he ran, or like he how he managed like some applications of this idea of collection of games, like with the solitary collection. Um, Again, this is open to anybody who has a question.
Yeah, and I'm totally happy with if something comes to your mind later. Uh, I'm totally fine with chatting later about anything.
Yeah, I'll just throw something out there, like um, how how do you usually, like you were talking about how to pick the main system you try to apply variations on, and you were talking about, hey, it's not about just being simple, it's about like being something you are familiar with. And I'm guessing, don't you sometimes want to break out of that mold and hey, that's useful, that works, that's cool, but also is it like pushing you too much in a certain direction, and yeah, and you're not like totally breaking free from some existing structures, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I feel like uh, since for me this is very much has been very much like a playful process of like seeing what kind of ideas I can get from a concept. It does feel like it's I feel most at home when approaching this from a fairly like a comfort zone esque like a or viewpoint. I guess on some level, for example, the solitaire collection was something where I didn't initially have an interest in exploring that, but after playing a game that also explored solitaire games and feeling like, okay, this is actually now interesting me, I got the like that gave me the push to start thinking about this from my own perspective of these solitaire games. So in that sense, I guess I could say that even though when I was thinking about those solitaire collection games and I was making the solitaire collection, I was already interested in the topic, and I was kind of working from the comfort zone of working on something that I feel I understand on some level. I had been acquainted with the concept of these solitaire games for such a short time that for like if you had asked the Hempuli from a year ago from there about solitaire games, I might have felt that, okay, that is not my comfort zone. So in that sense, I guess like there's a sliding scale going from working on something that you already know very well and like not exploring anything unusual to you to exploring something that you are completely uncomfortable with, where in the midway there is something where it's like a topic that is interesting to you but you haven't really thought about before that much, where you're kind of in your comfort zones because you're still thinking about something that is of interest to you, but it might be of interest to you in a level that you haven't really considered very deeply. I guess as a similar example, also related to Zachtronics games, I used to think personally that Zachtronics games were not for me. I don't enjoy optimization in video games, and Zachtronic games they are very optimization heavy games, and they were originally presented to me as these games about optimization. And then when I finally played Opus Magnum, that was the first Zachtronics game that really resonated with me. And I've later noticed that even though these like programming games were originally something that I kind of assumed were not for me, I've since developed an interest in them. And I could see, and I have slightly seen the same iteration or variant process happening with those kind of programming games, even though I haven't yet made any myself, but I do eventually hope to make some. And so in that as well, these programming games were something where originally I would have said that this is not my comfort zone. This is not something that I'm interested in, but over time I've developed an interest. And so exploring that space would no longer be like out of my comfort zone, despite not fully being in my comfort zone either. So maybe it would be like a happy compromise.
And do you think that when you are approaching things that you are not like 100% familiar with, that makes it easier to think of these variations? Because I don't know, maybe you are approaching optimization games like, oh, I hate this part about, I don't know, how you need to use the interface this way or try to get to this solution. And since you are like not fully in that area, it's easier for you to throw things out like, oh yeah, this thing that is like supposed to be like a core part of the system, that's going out because I don't like it. I'm gonna add something new that I do like.
Yeah, I do feel like if I understood the question correctly, I feel like especially with these like programming style games or these like factory style games, if I were to start this similar like making maybe a simple engine and thinking about like different ideas I can get out of the concept, I feel like there might be things there that where it's kind of like this is maybe not something that people who usually play these kinds of games are interested in, but it interests me because I'm approaching this from the viewpoint of someone who is more into it because of the like puzzle element rather than the like optimization, the like the making a machine work and trying to make the machine work as well as possible. It might be that I'm already too close to that world, and I would notice that, okay, well, I'm now approaching it from within the target area in such a way that I'm unable to come up with very interesting concepts. But then again, I feel like with the like Covemountlikes, for example, I started working with Sokoban block pushing games that I'm already very familiar with, and I felt like I was still able to found some certain interesting things that I found exciting to think about. Maybe partially because I was specifically approaching it from the viewpoint of like, what could I do with this that is unusual or odd? So I was specifically setting the like my goal to be something out of the left field, and so I was maybe able to get my brain a little bit out of the kind of like standard Sokoban world. So with these programming games, maybe if I were to think about like making a collection of simple programming games or factory games that follow the similar variation process, I might specifically start thinking of like what is something weird that could be done with this space. Like maybe just as a simple example, I mentioned earlier the like whodunit murder mystery Sokoban game. Maybe I could try thinking of like, would it be possible to make a programming like a factory game about murder mysteries? Maybe you need to make a machine that automatically solves murder mysteries by like moving knives on a conveyor belt to the victims and stabbing them. So you make like an automated murder machine, and that is the goal of the game. Maybe that could be something interesting. I don't know, but just as a very quick example of where my mind might go if I wanted to try to find something new and something that interests me within this space that I'm maybe not like fully inside personally, mentally.
No, yeah, I totally understand. There's a question in the chat. Do you ever find that you get stuck on exploring a given idea? I ask, as I have difficulty stopping at the exploration phase, I often want to complete and ship everything I start making.
To some extent, yes. I do notice something that I definitely noticed is that sometimes when I started implementing one of these, I'm specific, let's say, okay, it's both happened in the solitaire games and in the Covemountlikes and in the two-player abstract games, where sometimes I start working on an idea and I just can't figure out a way to make a certain concept work. So for example, I started pondering on a game that would be based on the lock paper puzzles by Blas Urban Grak. I don't know how to pronounce his name, unfortunately. Grakar, but Letibus Designs, Lock and Lock Digital. And I even asked Blas about like could I make a Covemount inspired by Lock, and he said yes, you can. And I started making it, and I eventually noticed that the basic idea I had for it just didn't feel as interesting as I was hoping. And eventually, once I had like exhausted my inspiration for that idea, once I had gotten like disappointed with the idea, I moved on. I left the game unfinished. But something that I do notice there is that I still have the idea sometimes come back to my mind, and I start pondering like, what if I could find a way to make it work? Is there still like I still enjoy what I made for this. So maybe there would be something that I could do with this that could be interesting. And it's very hard to let fully go of those ideas where it's kind of like you feel like there might be something there if you just explore long enough. Or maybe I could just make a really fledgling game, leave it really simple, just to like showcase what I already have and just be very clear that this is very lackluster, this is completely unfinished. But like fully letting go of an idea and saying that, yes, this idea just didn't work. I'm leaving it fully behind, never to return to it, and moving on with my life is very difficult, especially because I enjoy archival, I enjoy listing my ideas, I enjoy keeping track of my ideas. And so if I have an entry on my ideas list that I later feel is not as good as I was hoping, sometimes, very rarely, I'm able to say that, okay, this idea, it just is not fun at all. I'll just strike it over and leave it out completely of my mind. But most of the time what happens is that I work on an idea, it doesn't work as well as I was hoping, but it still has something that feels interesting, and then I'm completely unable to let go of it. And I keep returning to it every now and then, even though I know that the previous time I tried, it didn't go anywhere. I hope that is close enough to what we were talking about to maybe be a point of resonation. But I do feel like it's still possible for me to kind of move on from an idea, even if I keep returning to it and feeling bad about never finishing it. But just so far, I haven't gotten like fully stuck where it would be kind of I'm working on this idea and I cannot move on until I finish it, even though I'm not having fun anymore and I'm just frustrated with it.
There was another question in the chat that is sort of going along these lines, but in a different direction. Like, can you get stuck because you are having too much fun? I guess, like adding lots of variations to a single project. So instead of I'm just gonna jump to another small thing, you just keep making it bigger and bigger and bigger and more things to it.
Yeah. So with this, with all of these, I feel like because the core idea is always of the form, like here's this base core concept of some kind, a solitaire or block pushing game, a 2-player board game, and then I add this singular element to it. Most of the time so far, at least, what that has meant has been that it's very clear to me when the ideas I'm adding for a concept are still related somehow to the core idea and when I'm starting to move away from the core concept. If I was making a larger game, if my intent was to make like a 2-hour, 3-hour experience, then I feel like it would be easier to get into the problem. And I've definitely noticed it before. I've talked about it previously on presentations where you get into the problem of like trying to expand on an idea and then adding elements that are no longer part of the like core concept, and you start like bloating the idea instead of keeping to the core concepts. But with these, because the scope is intentionally very small and there's a very clear of like, I have the core idea plus one thing. Most of the time that usually leads into a very limited number of iterations or ideas I can come up with. And so the like about 15 levels that I mentioned is usually, or 14 levels, is usually what I need to explore a concept fully enough. There have been a couple of examples where, as I work on an idea, I notice that, like, oh, I could explore this idea further in this direction, but I don't. I'm too lazy at the moment to implement that additional concept for this engine, or it would be really annoying to implement with the limitations of the engine I'm working under, uh, or yeah, it would take too much time, and then I might write it down mentally as like, okay, this might be something that I want to return to later for a hypothetical like a sequel, or for the hypothetical Covemount-like collection, I might like expand on this idea because I noticed this implication that could be explored that is still part of the like core concept. It doesn't veer too far away from it, but was still too much for this quick exploration. Yeah, I think that's that. Just I guess as a like concrete example of the idea. For example, for the one Covemount-like that I mentioned, the idea where every wall is a warp portal that warps you, like wraps you around to the closest wall on the opposite side of the level or the opposite side of the room, and you can make new warp portals by moving pushable blocks into different positions or wrapping points. When I started working on it, that was the basic concept. It gave me very clear ideas of what I need to implement. I need to implement pushable blocks, potentially multi-pushable blocks as a variation of normal pushable blocks. I need to implement walls. And then when I considered it more like what would I need to explore this idea as fully as I can within like 15 to 20 levels, I started thinking, okay, I'll add water, which doesn't act as a wall for the wrapping property, but acts as a wall for the player because you cannot move over it. I will add points that work the opposite way, where they are not walls for the player, but they are walls for the wrapping property. And then finally, I will add walls that cannot be wrapped with, that are kind of walls that block the wrapping ability completely. And I feel like these 3 additional elements were already kind of enough to explore. I guess I would still have buttons and doors that open when you push the buttons. Those also added a couple of extra elements that could be explored. But I feel like after going through these concepts, I wouldn't have had that many additional things to add to the idea without starting to without having to spend more time kind of brainstorming new ideas. So it felt like a very natural cutting off point of like, okay, I'll add these concepts and that the game is large enough that I can do what I want to do. And then maybe if I in the future I get more ideas for maybe like multi-tile blocks and how the wrapping interacts with those, that might be an interesting thing to explore. But it felt like something that would be messy enough that I wouldn't want to go there with this concept. Maybe later with something else, but not now.